and welcome to episode 27 of Philosochat. My guest for this episode is YouTuber Michael Black, formerly an Intel analyst, a political commentator at present, and also an occult philosopher. These are the things he talks about a lot on his channel. Hence the reason I wanted to speak to him, because I thought it might be a good idea to discuss the occult with him. And in particular, I was hoping to delve into occultocracy, which is a word I haven't heard of before until Michael Black mentioned it in a video. So we'll be delving into cult themes, basically, that allude to how this is used to control and shape the world around us. Welcome, Michael Black, to Philosochat.
Thank you very much, my friend. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. The subject matter that we're going to touch on, I think, is so critical to understanding the world that we live in right now, because there's so much going on that is almost impossible for people to piece together due to the fact that it is so compartmentalized. And a great bulk of that actually does rely very heavily on the occult. And it's so necessary for people to take that on board, even though at first it seems like an utterly ridiculous notion and a ridiculous concept that the people that are in power presently, or at least the global power brokers, might actually be occultists. Because what has happened, sorry if I can just say this, what has happened over time is that the occult has been directly associated with anything that is supernatural or superstitious, which it never started out as, and it certainly later on it branched into various things. But initially speaking, when occult practices or philosophies were, when people came up with those, they were the first instances of science and mathematics and cryptography and all these other various facets of human inquiry that people were looking at. Those were the first instances of those. So that's why it's so important that people have a full understanding of what the occult is. It's nothing to do with any sort of superstitious mumbo jumbo or hoodoo voodoo. Although in later texts, things did become a little bit more corrupted. But we can talk about those influences as we go through this. So yeah,
I'm sure it'll be a very interesting discussion. There's already lots of things I'd like to address and ask you as well. But since you're new to Philosochat, I always like to ask people a little bit about themselves before we continue, because the audience might want to know a bit about you as well. So what I usually ask people is, to describe their political views and the description of their online work. Particularly in your case, could you describe to me what you mean when you say that you're a former Intel analyst?
Sure. I can give you a basic breakdown of that. I originally was in the army. I joined the army at 16, and I was in the Royal Signals, and I spent about 3 years in total there, and 2 on secondment to an Intel branch, which I won't disclose here. But as a result of a lot of that work, I ended up going into intelligence analysis, and did that in the private sector for some time as well. So I've got a very full understanding of the ins and outs of what is really going on. And when I realized how serious the problems were, and they were quite endemic in Western society, specifically in the UK and of course in America as well, just due to the natural special relationship between the two countries, when I realized how widespread the problems were, the problems I'm speaking about here are those of socialism and communism and an infiltration into these countries by these ideologies, fundamentally, into the institutions, and how long and far advanced these things were. I thought it was incumbent upon me to try and do something about that, even at this late stage. Because it seemed to me that people just weren't learning quickly enough, even though a lot of people have disseminated that information. So that's one of the reasons why I set my channel up.
Okay. Now, what about you as politically? How would you describe yourself? I'll say this much. Whenever I invite people to Philosochat, I try to learn as much about them as possible. And, I've known about you for a little while now, and I've watched quite a few of your videos recently just to have a good idea of where you stand. The way you describe things is very similar to me in in the sense of saying that things all link back to natural law. That's very important to me. I think everything stems from natural law in terms of rights, responsibilities, and how we understand the world. So on that basis, you and I imagine, are very similar. Would you agree to that? Or what would you say to in that sense?
I would say that fundamentally, without understanding what natural law is, you can't really progress as a human being in any moral sense, because you have to use that as your guide in discerning right actions from wrong actions. And too many people can't do that because of the moral relativism that has creeped into culture. Now, as for my own political beliefs and leanings, what I would say in regards to that is, I don't fit into any kind of box, and I won't be boxed in by anyone with regards to what I am or who I am. And I don't mean that in a sort of facetious sense. I just mean that no political paradigm or philosophy truly describes where I sit on the political spectrum. At best, if people wanted to use the best description, I guess they could call me a libertarian. Or possibly an anarchist in the true Greek sense of that word. We could go into that as well, but sure. I think anyone who's familiar with the etymology of language will understand.
Yeah, I think I don't fit very well into the political paradigm as we see today. But what I realize is that everything exists on a spectrum, because that's causality, you know? I mean, just look at gravity, you know, I mean, the heaviest, well, actually, it doesn't matter how heavy an object is, it on the earth, it'll still go to the earth and the ground at the same speed. But I don't know, if you put something on the moon, gravity responds differently. There's a spectrum of gravitational effects, and causality in terms of actions and ideas works in the same way, which is why, for example, this idea that communists are on the left and fascists are on the right is irrational. So for me, I like to think that, you know, we can get kind of bogged down in where things fit in terms of left and right. But certainly when I've started to look into the occult as well, and the left-hand path and the right-hand path, it kind of fits with the way I talk about things, because the right-hand path usually describes a strong affinity with natural law, whilst the left-hand path is personal anarchism, which is basically nihilism, egoism, no regard for morality. It's just pure egoism and just trying to shape the world in the way you want. So this is why I still think left and right has relevance when we really drill down to what that means. So yeah, I mean, perhaps I'm not sure it does digress that much in terms of what we're going to talk about here, because if we're going to talk about the occult, inevitably we're going to talk about light occult and dark occult, which I'm in two minds about. So what would you add to that?
Well, first of all, to address some of the stuff that you were saying there with regards to how the left-right paradigm links with the occult, what I would say with that is that it mirrors basically the Kabbalistic tradition. This is part of the reason why I won't be put into a box. If anything, I would be classed as a centrist, quite honestly, as I think you perhaps yourself might. We might lean right of center or slightly left of center, but in general terms, I will not stray from that center. And there's a very good reason for that, which is this. So in occult philosophy, as I'm sure you're familiar with, especially in Kabbalistic tradition, you've got the path of severity and you've got the path of mercy, right? And that's your right-hand pillar and your left-hand pillar. And that literally mirrors, in terms of the political paradigms, the left and the right in politics today as well, right? Or at least it was supposed to. There's another point I'd like to mention in regards to the politics of it, which we can get back to. But that's the way that the occult traditions perceive things. Now, the ideal path in terms of the way that the occult aspects would suggest is the path of the path of mildness, which is the middle path essentially, and that is why the center path, because you need to be severe at times, but you also need to have that empathy and whatnot as well. It's a strange blend of compassion, but also with self-discipline.
Perhaps this is where, you know, I might not be as what I would basically say to that is that I adhere to pure natural law. I think everything like rights and responsibility stem purely from natural law, which is actually a very libertarian idea at its purest. And when we're talking about harshness, I can see how that stems from the left-hand path, because even in the Bible, actually the right-hand path, because obviously in the Bible it talks about God being on his throne with the right hand being Jesus, who was meek, and the left hand, which was the sheep, and then the left hand being the goat, which is judgment. So yeah, it stems back to that as well. But at the same time, I wonder really if this really makes as much sense as it could, because obviously just because we believe in adhering to natural law, it doesn't mean we don't believe in punishment or judgment when you stray from that. What do you think about that?
Punishment's an interesting concept. I didn't think we'd end up going down this sort of road, but okay. But punishment can be necessary in some respects. Some authority, for example, is necessary for us to have a semblance of boundaries in what our boundaries are in societies as human beings. Because to give an analogy of this, I think of things in a very strange sort of way, as you've probably guessed. But to think of an analogy to this, if you consider this coffee mug that I've got, for example, right? Now, the borders of that coffee mug allow the liquid inside it, which is a continuum, if you will, to stay in that, right? And remain as a liquid. But the moment the cup shatters, then the liquid has no container. There's no boundaries left. So in the same vein, we as human beings, I think we need to know where the boundaries are, so that the people that do want to test the boundaries, the people that are oddballs, if you like perhaps myself or others, we can thus be that continuum. We can explore weird ideas and strange ideas because we know where the limits are for things, because other people that have come before us have told us what they are. So
yeah, okay. So I mean, this is such an in-depth subject, as you're well aware, and I'm sure some of my audience are as well. But okay, I mean, I'm fascinated by this idea of where we sit in terms of a left-hand and right-hand path as well. Maybe we can get back to that as the discussion progresses. But let's talk about what the occult is then. What does occult mean? I mean, I myself know, but you being the guest, Michael Black, could you explain to the audience what occult means?
Well, occult basically comes from the Latin, meaning that which is hidden, essentially. The same root word derives into oculus, meaning what you see. And so occult is the Latin variation of that, meaning what you don't see, or what is kept from you, what remains hidden from you. It's the same vein as the Greek word apocrypha, which not a lot of people understand either. This is one of the great banes, I think, just as a social commentary. I think it's one of the great banes of society, that schooling systems no longer teach these things. They don't teach Latin. They don't teach Greek anymore. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that it actually helps them to occult knowledge, because then people can't discern what is what and what words mean. And thus, this is what's happened as a result, again, of cultural relativism and moral relativism, which has been done purposefully, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that as well.
Yeah, sure.
But in terms of the concepts of what the occult is, I would say it's basically hidden knowledge, and the people that have created this system that we're living under right now, which is a very unjust system, and it's a system that relies completely on reversing everything around us. So
an inversion,
yes. Yeah. It's very early in the morning here for me, so you'll have to excuse me. I'm still
no, you do. Great insight so far, Michael. Thank you. You got quite a thick Scottish accent as well. I mean, I presume that means you're from Scotland in some way, and I'm sure you've talked about that in another video. But are you still in Scotland, or?
Presently, I'd rather not
go into that.
Where I am, just because of security concerns right now, because of the stuff that I not only talk about on my channel, but the work that I've done.
Okay.
death threats. You know how it is, man. You know.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Now, the other thing about the occult is we get this esoteric world, which is the hidden world, and then the world that is given to the ignorant masses, if you like, is the exoteric world. And you find this constantly, that whenever you delve into the occult, you have the esoteric and the exoteric. So the Freemasons are charitable people who do good things for humanity, you know, and that's what they're known for. They're philanthropists. But underneath that, there's all these other things going on. Now, this is probably how we can segue now into the core of this video, which is an occultocracy. Now, I like that term because it's a great summary of what a lot of people think in terms of what the occult is used for. This hidden knowledge is constantly around us, but it's hidden in plain sight as well. So you get this symbolism that I've increasingly started to notice and started to wonder, well, you know, is that an occult symbol there of Semiramis or something? Or, you know, or is that why have they got the eye of Nimrod there, or the all-seeing eye? What's that about? So yeah, what would you say about that?
Well, I think there's a lot of use of prototypical and esoteric, exoteric ideas that are permeated through society via symbolism. That's certainly true. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to notice that. Advertisers use it. The biggest corporations use it. Any sort of government institution uses it. To give one example of this is how blatant it is, but people don't realize it, right? I was having to point this out to somebody just literally last year when we in the UK, because we're both in the UK, right? So apologies to our American viewers, right? But over in the UK, when we had this coverage on the BBC, for example, when it came to the election, one of the key symbols they were using was a hexagon to represent the election, the voting thing that was going to happen, right? And nobody cottoned on to what they were saying with that or what they were doing with that, right? Everyone thought, well, that's, you know, just par for the course. It's just the BBC doing its thing.
Which hexagon are you talking about now for the symbol for voting?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I know what the hexagon is. Go on, you explain what that means in an occult sense. But yeah, you continue there and explain to the audience.
Well, the hexagon is basically Saturnian symbolism, right? It represents Saturn and all the harshness of Saturn. Saturn, of course, according to mythology, because they rely on this symbology because it's archetypical and prototypical, as I say. So Saturn ate his own children, basically. So it's the absolute harsh manifestation of what would we call it? Authoritarianism, I guess. It's the father eating his children.
Yeah. So, okay. And also the hexagon, I've heard it described as a symbol that means you're completely trapped on all sides. So when you use that symbol, it relates to the 5-pointed star as well, like the Star of David and the like, and it all actually. Let me think. The six-pointed star. Six-pointed star. Excuse me. Yeah, and it's a symbol of, which means that you're trapped, because you can draw a 6-pointed star within a hexagon, and then so it relates to you being trapped. Now, the person who described it that way was Mark Passio when he was talking about symbols, and I found that quite interesting. So yeah, I mean, the difficult thing is it's not always blatant. Now, I have found symbols that are very blatant that I will go into as we continue. But then somebody could just say, "Oh, well, that's a hexagon. That's all it is." You know, why are you putting so much relevance into that? But perhaps once
can I just say this? Just add this as well.
Sure.
It's not about one specific interpretation of a symbol, by the way, right? And this is something that Carl Jung recognized as well. Every person interprets that symbol in their own way. They extrapolate something from it. But if enough people extrapolate the same meaning from it, then the symbol does take on a meaning of a particular nature. Examples of this would be the alphabet that we use, the very letters that we use to communicate and to write, okay?
Right.
We agree on what those mean, therefore they mean that particular thing, like the letter A means the letter A. But the letter A is just a concept. It's just a a particular pictorial representation of an idea. But because enough people agree on what that idea is, then it takes on that meaning. So, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now, occultocracy, how would you describe that?
I would describe an occultocracy as a complete subversion, which is fundamentally what it is, a complete subversion of the power structures which exist or are necessary in society for that society to function. That's how I would describe it. And it's been done by, I hate to use these terms because the occult is simply the occult, but in order to differentiate what the heck is going on at the moment, we could ascribe it to a dark occult power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
Which is what because we initially mentioned that we're going to go into that. So, yeah, inevitably we have. So, dark occult then. So, talk a bit more about that.
Sure. So, in terms of dark occultism, there is no such thing as specifically the dark occult. But the reason I use that term and others have used that term is because when you decouple the human being from any sense of natural law or from any sense of morality or truth, or if everything becomes subjective and solipsistic, then there are no boundaries, there are no limits for that human being. And the human being, just like that example with the mug, if I break the mug, the liquid will spill out, right? The human being loses touch with reality. And therefore, it becomes a self-destructive spiral, right? So it's a path to self-destruction fundamentally for anyone who follows those philosophies. And that is analogous, and I go into this on my own channel, and I think you probably have touched on this slightly as well, is that descends into the Klipothic realm according to the Kabbalistic traditions. Yeah.
Which is something I'm going to go into in a lot more detail, and I think we'll probably mention it here. I wondered whether we'd have time. But yeah, the Kabbalah is and the dark occult. This is something you've already mentioned, for example, but talking about yourself, how you like to stay in the center path. Now, in theory, you can see how that works. You need a balance between the light and the dark. And so you would think then, when you're talking about every occult tradition has an inversion. That's what you find, isn't it?
Yes.
So because there's an inversion of every type of occult tradition, what you're basically saying is the idea is that you can actually take things from both sides if you do it properly. Is that what you're saying? If you do it properly, would you agree with that? Is that what's supposed to happen in relation to what you've said?
Yes.
And then if you talk about occultocracy, what they're doing is they're pushing you down, or society down, a dark occult path to control and manipulate people. Am I on the right track here in terms of how you would describe it?
Basically, yes. I mean, it's far more complex than that. But yes, fundamentally, that is.
I mean, I'm trying to use simple descriptions here for a very complex subject. So I do that a lot. I try to do that. And then you break it down in more complexity as you move along. But yeah, continue.
No, you're quite right to do that. Because when you're introducing these ideas to people, I do this myself as well. It's like you start off with something simple. But in terms of the... if you want to call it the light and the dark, we all have light in us, we all have darkness in us, if you want to put it in those simplistic terms, right? Or we all have that capability to do the very worst, and we also have it in us to do the very best. And therefore it's dependent utterly on both the choices that we make and also the deterministic set of laws that we're handed, if you like, the deterministic boundaries that we're given at birth as well. Those might be genetic, those might be dependent upon our culture, those might be, there's a million things that might depend on. But there's a mixture of nature and nurture, if you like. Everything in life is very much a mix of the grey. That being said, the grey can only exist if there is a black and a white.
Yeah, sure. I can totally see what you're thinking or you're saying there. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, this is all, I love abstract conversations. I love philosophy because I love philosophy. So for some, and I could talk about this all day, but for the audience then who might not be familiar with this stuff, we're going to probably need to give some more solid examples of how in the world we live in, the dark occult is used to control people or to shape society. Can you give a good example for somebody who might not have a clue what we're talking about because it's too abstract at this point?
Right. Okay. So to give a definitive sense of it, let's take a look at the political paradigms. Okay, that's the easiest way, as far as I can see, to describe this, which is why I've chosen to do it this way on my channel as well. Is through the following. So socialism or communism, which we've talked about, which has basically infected the entire system as it stands. It's a totalitarian ideology, and it's worked out very well because there has been this long march through the institutions via the Frankfurt School, Gramsci, so on. Why are we talking about this? Well, because all those ideas can fundamentally be traced back to a guy called Francois Fourier, who I talked about in one of my videos. Now, Fourier is the father of socialism and communism. He is the father of feminism, for example, as well, which has been utterly detrimental to society. It's destroyed the family, and it's one of its key goals from its origins was to destroy the family. But this guy was also an occultist, a dark occultist. This is what he was involved in, was what we would consider in modern times to be satanic systems, right? And so when you look at socialism and communism and their derivatives and what they have produced, which is primarily violent revolutions, violent authoritarian states, this is an example, a concrete example of the dark occult. It literally is as simple as that. There's not that much more complexity to that. There were others that carried ideas forward, like Babeuf and Eliphas Levi and so on, who could be described as the father of modern-day Satanism. That's an entire...
You're talking about Sandor Levay?
Yes. Well, no,
yeah, yes.
That came later on.
No, sorry. Who did you mention then? I didn't catch that.
Eliphas Levi, who was considered the first sorcerer occultist.
Right, okay. Because obviously what you find is there are people within certain eras that adapt it for that time, for that epoch, you know, or that current zeitgeist. They reframe it so it fits into that.
Yes.
In the modern era, for example, in the 20th century, certainly around the 19th century or in the Enlightenment, you had theosophy, which was the way that a lot of these ideas were transferred to the New Age, you know, and for example. So, okay, now I'm interested by these things you're talking about with the start of socialism. Now, obviously, and communism. Now, obviously, I know that Marx wasn't the guy who started communism or socialism off. He was the most popular. But I'm fascinated by this idea that there are occult themes that are at the heart of this. And so far, my research has only really taken me to, the only thing I've really come across in this sense is Adam Weishaupt, and I've managed to dig some stuff up on him and obviously he's the guy who started off the Illuminati in Bavaria. And there was a point where he sort of disappeared off the scene just before these things started to take place in the 20th century. And some people say he had a great influence on those things happening. The trouble is, like a lot of things involving the occult, there just seems to be a point where you can no longer verify anything in any easy fashion. There is evidence of the Illuminati and Adam Weishaupt out there, but then suddenly he kind of disappears off the face of the earth. And some people say he continued to work in the background because it was obviously the Illuminati was an organization that did exist. That's a fact. And it was actually an occult organization within an occult organization, this occult organization being the Freemasons. So there are things you can verify, and then bang, all of a sudden, these things start to happen in line with what these organizations wanted to take place, but then you can't link it to them, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, insofar as the Illuminati is concerned, this is one of the questions I get asked most frequently, ironically enough. It's difficult to explain to people that there is no such organization today as the Illuminati, as it's termed. That organization was disbanded completely and utterly, basically at the start of the 19th century.
That's what I was saying. But then some people say at that point it did continue to operate. Now, that's where it can't be proven. I haven't found any evidence for that, and I doubt anybody can. But the trouble is, there are certain things that the Illuminati said they wanted to create, like a brotherhood of man and the like, and destruction of property, the destruction, all the things that essentially communists wanted to achieve, and they took place.
Yeah, basically what the Illuminati was. Okay, so the reason people have this idea that the Illuminati still exists, which it doesn't, there's other groups that have taken its place, and I won't go into these here because it would take too much time. But the primary reason is because there were these, and I'm not saying this in a way to denigrate them in any way, shape, or form, but these conspiracy theorists that came along in the 80s and the 90s, right? Well-known people like Alex Jones, David Icke, those kinds of people. And what they've done is they've convinced people of this through misdirection, because people started to look at the $1 bill, for example, and the seal on the back of the $1 bill with the pyramid and the eye and so forth. And they started to trace that back, and they thought, well, okay, that proves the existence of the Illuminati even today. That's not strictly true, though, right? Because what happened was that Weishaupt himself was very heavily inspired by the people that I'm speaking about, that you can look up in any historical record or document, whether it's Fourier or Babeuf, or whether it's Eliphas Levi. All these things are well documented, that these people were heavy-duty occultists, and they were also heavily involved in the creation of what later became socialism and communism proper. So it's natural that and to give a further illustration of this, when I was talking about Francois Fourier, and I know we're going into all kinds of strange threads.
No, you carry on, because this is something I wanted to discuss anyway. One of the things I had down that I would like to chat with you about is how, because the roots of communism and socialism, because you brought that up in your Occultocracy video, and obviously this is at the core of it, because if you look around, everything is dominated by socialism and communism. We have a paradigm, a dialectic, which takes us back to socialism, whatever happens. And this is the thing that, fascism is a form of socialism. It's not communism. But you wouldn't believe how many times I've had to bang my head against the wall with some people explaining that, because they are stuck, they are trapped in this way of thinking, which goes back to this idea of a hexagram and this occult way of thinking, where you trap people within a certain dialectic and you move people from a thesis and antithesis to a synthesis, So yeah, please continue.
No, you're quite right. So with Fourier, what he also did was mention in his own works a considerable number of times the creation of a new world order. Okay, so if anything does exist, what people refer to as the New World Order, that is a very real phenomenon. And that is central to what is being implemented right now. That's the common thread constantly. It doesn't matter which cult it is. It doesn't matter which occult group it might be. It doesn't matter which organization it might be. Fundamentally, they're implementing that same agenda. That's all that's happening. It's just that you end up with the ideological descendants of the people who create the initial ideas, and then they carry it forward and evolve them and implement them further, and so on and so forth. That's fundamentally what's going on, because they have this belief at their core that they can create the perfect utopian society. That is what is driving them, right? These dark occult groups, these satanic groups, if you want to call them that, honestly and truly believe that they have a system that is of absolute benefit to humanity in the long term.
Do they really believe that it's a benefit to everyone? That's the question. And I would say that my research indicates that's not true. They want a system where an elite dominate everybody else. Correct. And the rest of humanity is treated like cattle.
Correct.
Now, you've mentioned Satanism in your Occultocracy video. I've talked about Satanism a lot lately. I've been quite shocked at how prevalent it is in our society, even if it's just the values of Satanism, which is which is personal anarchism, the left-hand path, which is what we've already mentioned. So these people, they don't care about anyone but themselves, but they work together almost in a clique at the top, trying to transcend to the top of this structure. So they're the ones that dominate. They might actually screw one another over, and they often do, I'm sure. But at the same time, if you don't have that esoteric knowledge, you're a fool, you're an idiot, you deserve to be mistreated. And you know, it's so in depth. I mean, I could go on about how they use this is why they like symbols, because in a way they're telling you what they're going to do. So then because of that, because they believe in karma, it doesn't come back on them, because they're kind of telling you what's going to happen anyway. So it's your own fault if you suffer that way. They like order followers as well. So these people do the dirty work for them, and it doesn't come back on them. I mean, I could go on.
No, that's 100% correct. When I say that they're looking to benefit humanity, I'm not talking about individual human beings. They're looking at humanity as a species. Here's the problem with their argument. They're not wrong, okay? This is the thing I struggle with the most, is that they are not wrong. And that makes it very, very difficult to counter what they're doing right now, because they believe that humanity is destined to ignorance by and large, and that only a select few group of people deserve the knowledge that they have or that they possess, and that anyone who doesn't seek that knowledge, who is caught in the paradigms that they've designed, basically the traps that are there for the mind are created by them, right? And then they at the same time scoff and laugh at the people who have gotten caught up in them. It's a form of sadism, fundamentally.
I mean, you've described how these people also, they don't want power or money. So there are some disagreements that I think we have, but I'm not sure if these necessarily we disagree. Maybe we just describe things differently. I see this elite class as people that they see themselves as above humanity, and they've created systems where they can live above the, laws are for the cattle, and they've created a way of living where they don't have to worry about anything. And they can sort of satisfy any desires they like, anything, however sadistic. And basically, they have these rituals and these ceremonies and these traditions that are so they're so detailed that you reach a point where you do have to question how much do they really believe this stuff is real in the sense of a satanic entity, because you wouldn't go through that much. If you thought this stuff was just superstitious mumbo jumbo, you wouldn't go into this much detail. You wouldn't take this stuff so seriously. So this is where the sort of metaphysical, spiritual questions start to arise that I'm asking at the moment. I mean, technically, I am actually an atheist, but this is where I currently am.
I would say that your thinking is in the right direction, essentially. Thorstein Veblen, the economist, noted quite a long time ago that the ruling classes were amongst the most superstitious. And that is absolutely true, because at the core of every human being are these existential questions about where we come from and who we are. And these people believe that they have the answers to all of that. And some of that relies quite heavily upon these ancient traditions that are somewhat superstitious in nature. At the very least, they're dogmatic. They are theological fundamentally. A great example of this is UFO cults, right? And you'll say, what is the link between this and UFO cults, right? But UFO cults provide even atheists or self-described atheists
with something to believe in.
Exactly. Right. So it's a similar kind of thing to what these guys are like. If you were to ask them outright whether they have any theological beliefs, they'd be honest in saying, no, we don't. But if you look at their behaviors, if you look at as you say, the rituals that they go through, most of which are not public, by the way, but
they're becoming public, aren't they? That's the thing. There's a few things I've talked about on my channel, which has made me think they're coming out of the shadows. But yeah, go on. Maybe we'll end up going off on another tangent if we talk about that, because it's so detailed. But yeah, please continue.
Yeah, no, you're completely right about this. So there are elements of it that have become public as a result of, for example, the WikiLeaks email releases and the stuff that was going on with spirit cooking and what was her name, Maria Abramovich, and so on, and all this sort of business. And what was that all about? Well, I happen to know that, and I think you know that as well, because anyone who's really looked at that does know what the heck that's all about. And I think you went into this in one of your videos.
Actually, I did, yeah, I did. I've gone over spirit cooking and Pizzagate in some detail, and I've now moved on to other things as well. Yeah,
yeah. Pizzagate, that was designed. A lot of stuff is misdirection, unfortunately, and Pizzagate was one of those. But here's the one thing I will say, and I'm going to say this absolutely definitively, without a shadow of a doubt, right? The people that are in power right now do abuse children. They absolutely do, right? They have no problem doing that because they have no moral compass. They have rejected any semblance of morality, right? That being said, the stuff with Pizzagate was designed to discredit anyone.
I'll say, can I just say a little bit about that? That I know all I will say is I have looked into it in detail. I'm not completely convinced about that. I mean, for me, all that happened. Well, do you know how people talk about 4chan being so great at investigative journalism? It came from them. Now they did the digging and they found some stuff, but everything was stonewalled at that point. I've looked at that evidence, which has now been removed. I've actually got images of these things on the video I made about it, and I've still got links. If you look at it, there's some creepy stuff going on. Now, at no point did anyone within the Pizzagate investigation actually say, oh, well, this is proven. We simply said there should be an investigation. And it's not unlike any other child sex trafficking or child sex ring situation we've had, where it's all covered up and the evidence disappears. It's just something that should have been dealt with by the authorities and was brushed under the carpet. For me, when I look at the evidence, I simply see something that should be investigated, and it wasn't. Simple as that. So, obviously I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but I just would want to say that for the record.
No, that's completely fair, man. But the reason I say what I say with absolute assertion is because if one looks at the case of Jimmy Savile that we had over here in the UK, or if you look at what happened with Cyril Smith and the cover-up there, and the House of Commons and the cover-ups that are going on there with regards to child abuse, or you look at the Rotherham scandal, or you look at the Rochdale scandal, or any of these things that are going on, which are crimes against children, which are instances of child sexual abuse, that governments seem to want to cover up left, right, and center. High up people in the police service want to cover up
files left, right, disappear. It's just so obvious that there's a cover up, and those patterns were, for me, present within Pizzagate. There were things that 4chan uncovered.
Yeah,
and they were trying to shut this down. They were desperate to shut down 4chan talking about this. And people, and honestly, they went down hard. They would go, even Alex Jones panicked because they were going to really throw the book at him if he continued to dig at this. So yeah,
there's a lot more to it than the Pizzagate thing, right?
Oh, that's sure is. That's why they transferred it, the hashtag from Pizzagate to Pedogate now, which is a much more accurate description. This is a global sex trafficking ring.
Yes. Basically, yes. One of these examples, and I'll cover this on my channel, I was working with some people, I won't go into details with regards to that, but this was to do with a Russian pedophile network that was operating inside Russia. And they were using children to get at certain US politicians and so forth. That's on my channel. You can look at that. All those people now have ended up in the hands of the authorities, by the way. So,
are you talking about the investigation that Trump has been quietly doing in the background since he came became the president?
It touches on that. It touches on that. Yes, there are lines that cross, shall we say, but we don't need to go into this too much because this kind of detracts from the main substance of what we're talking about. But it is so important for people to realize that there are enormously evil actions happening as a result of these occult forces, if you like. It's literally as simple as that. This occultocracy is allowing this to happen. In fact, it's encouraging this to happen. One of the reasons for this, and this is the reason why I'm talking about it as well, I guess, is the people at the very top of the food chain. And I mentioned the groups that are actually involved in this myself, and I'm not going to talk about them here, right? But those groups, they would never themselves ever engage in anything that transgressed natural law or moral laws. They themselves never would. But, okay, the very top groups I'm talking about at the top of the pyramid. But further down below, they encourage everyone else to do it because it compromises them.
They can use it to blackmail them. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's an interest. I definitely agree with that. Blackmail is involved. I don't know. We don't know who these people are right at the top. There's the obvious people like the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. But I mean, and I don't know how we can prove that really, but I do feel as though there are these dark secret societies around that are engaging in some pretty twisted stuff. And I think that is really I've talked about that increasingly on my channel, but you know, just so we can get a few things in before we get to the end of this broadcast. Now, I would feel as though the most easy way for people to see what's going on around us is globalism, which has become a very popular term at the moment, and how there's a lot of occult symbolism and occult themes going through that, and particularly we can see that with the EU and the UN itself, which is the point I've reached. Now, you mentioned theology. Now, I know that you yourself are not a Christian. Technically, I'm not, but I would describe myself as a cultural Christian, if I'm completely honest. Now, there seems to be a very strong theological theme running through all of this stuff, and perhaps we might have some time to talk about that briefly before we finish this broadcast.
Mm-hmm. What specifically with regards
to that? Well, let's start with globalism, the EU and the UN. How do you think that relate? You tell me how you think that might relate to occultocracy.
Well, basically, they're the instruments, the apparatus that are used by these occult groups in order to inflict their evil, as it were, right, in a very real sense, on the people, right? So these systems that are set up, these groups that are set up, examples. This is one thing I find very, very difficult to explain to people because they have been boxed in, as you said earlier, right? They literally have been boxed in completely. So to give one example of this, the UN, the United Nations, right? There was a point when the United Nations did not exist. Today, people cannot fathom that being a reality. Okay? There was a point when the European Union did not exist. Today, people can't fathom that. Why? Because we have this blind spot as human beings, right? Which doesn't allow us to go past our own self-awareness, our starting point, our birth, and everything that proceeds from that, right? So when you try to explain to people that these institutions were created, they were created, and therefore they can be dismantled just as easily, they find that a very difficult concept to grapple with because the generations that are alive today have no memory.
And again, they've been trapped in that way of thinking because they don't understand natural law. They just don't understand it. And once you get natural law, you understand how causality fundamentally works and where rights come from, where freedom comes from, how freedom cannot be given to you. Because by definition, you are an autonomous individual with your own mind. Mm-hmm. You know, then you see how everything around you is being sculpted to trap you into a way of thinking wherein you think I need authority, which is why in the UK in particular, every time something happens, what's the government going to do about it? And I believe you've mentioned that, actually. I'm not too sure, but I know that that's a point that has been mentioned several times. It just still seems to always be about going to authority and saying, what are you going to do to help me? It's not, what can I do to help myself?
Right. This is a theme I've touched on quite a lot in several of my conversations, both with other people and just generally on my channel as well. This need that human beings have now, what has happened is that you have been domesticated, right? Not yourself or myself. What I'm saying is that human beings, at large, they have been domesticated and are being used as cattle, right? You're being farmed right now. This is what people don't realize, right? And they have to wake up to this fact. You are being farmed. And the farmers are not interested in your welfare unless it suits their agenda. Right? This is what people don't get. For years and years, it was worthwhile for them to keep people alive and to keep people functional, which is why healthcare, for example, in the UK was socialized. The whole reason for that, what that came out of, was the employers demanding that the workers that they had actually have some form of healthcare so that they could work better, be more productive. That's what it's always been about. Anytime you've ever seen socialism implemented is so that the people at the top of the food chain can benefit from your sweat, your labor, your tears. Basically, your time and your energy, fundamentally, because that's all you've got in this life. And what people are doing right now, I'm kind of going off into a little tangent here, but what people are doing right now is they are swapping the most valuable things they have, which is their time and energy, for paper currency, right? Fiat currency.
Nothing, which is basically worthless. It's a system of usury at the end of the day, which is another big topic. I can totally see what you're saying. Yeah. I wanted to mention a couple of other things really before we finished. Now, let's get into the theological side to this.
Sure.
Have you noticed, for example, have you noticed any theological themes, for example, within the EU? Because one thing I noticed when I look at this globalist agenda is it's very much based around a Babylonian theme. It's like, for example, the EU Parliament in Strasbourg mimics a medieval painting of the Tower of Babel, even though it was most likely a pyramid. They were pyramid shaped. There were ziggurats, but still, it looks exactly the same. It's a depiction of it, to the point where you even get the river running alongside it being a piece of grass in the same shape. It's uncanny. And there was also a poster that was created with inverted pentagrams on it instead of EU stars. I talked about that in one of my videos called the Babylonian Cult of Globalism. And have you noticed these? Have you come across these things yourself? Have you noticed these themes when it comes to the EU and particularly the EU? It's uncanny that the link to this cult of Babylon, basically Babylon was the first civilization. So this theme of these secret societies, these mystery religions, keeps coming back to infect civilization through secret societies, which allows the worst of the worst to end up at the top.
Yes, historically, that is very much the case. I don't necessarily think myself that's due to their theological beliefs as such. What I think is going on with that, and you're right to point it out, by the way, because that is a very big piece of the puzzle. What is going on with that is that these people that are at the top of this pyramid of power believe themselves to be genealogical descendants of the priest classes from ancient Babylon.
Yeah, that's definitely true. That's something I believe I've mentioned it. If I haven't, I need to make it more clear, because that's a great point. Go on.
And that's exactly what they're doing. They're putting it in people's faces. They're explaining to people that we are the ones that rule you. We have always ruled you. That is the dominant sort of hierarchical belief system that they are implementing, that they're imposing on people in more ways than one. one of those ways is psychologically. So, yeah.
Yeah, so there we go. I mean, and of course, the strange thing is the more you dig, the more and more you dig, it always seems to stem back to interpretations of the Bible, like the Creed. Because obviously, the Babylonian cult or whatever else it is, it relates back to the story in the Garden of Eden and the interpretation of the serpent not being bad, but being good, giving you that hidden knowledge. And I've also, again, when I'm looking into Kabbalah, which I'm wondering really if that's actually at the very heart of the Babylonian mysteries, to be honest, as being the original, because the original center of where everything else stemmed from, you have the tree of knowledge, and you have the tree of, there's two trees, isn't there? And they both represent trees within the Garden of Eden, and it all stems back to there. And it's incredibly in depth. This is something I will want to talk about more in the future. But again, it stems back to theology, which it seems to me as though Jewish traditions in one form or another, whether it's Kabbalah or just Orthodox Judaism, has been reinterpreted along the way to get us to where we are today, where there's so many different interpretations.
This is correct, but it's also missing something, a key ingredient. So I'll try, if we can, in the short time that we've got left, because there's been so much to cover.
Absolutely,
neither of us is. Yeah, especially with a discussion like this, my friend. But in terms of the Kabbalistic traditions, they come from Egypt, right? The ancient land of Shem. And the concepts that you're talking about here are actually analogous to the Egyptian ideas of Set and Horus and Apep, right? So Apep is a mirror analog, if you will, of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, because Apep represents chaos. You have Set, who is representing the dark side, if you will. That's also where we get the term sunset from, by the way, and a lot of people just don't know that. I find that fascinating. But so Set represents the satanic path, the left-hand path, if you will, because he's seen as the one who directly challenges Horus, who was the sun god, right? He was the son of Osiris, right? So there's all these interesting mythological arcs. The reason I'm mentioning all of that is because the biblical texts are completely analogous to they're a complete mirror of, rather, the Egyptian traditions, if you will. The mystical traditions go back to the same thing. So this is thousands of years old. These ideas, they're not new, and a lot of that is to do with order versus chaos. These ideas that we're still grappling with today. That's fundamentally what it's all about, and the concepts that the Illuminati even had during their existence, their short existence, was to bring order out of chaos, right? So this is been maintained through the centuries. But the thing of it is that what has never been understood by these people is that over time, the verbal transmissions or the written transmissions have been corrupted, as they naturally would become. And so they've got a very skewed understanding of the mystery traditions, these dark occultists, if we can call them that, right? They've got a very skewed understanding of things. And they don't realize the level of their misinterpretation, because oral traditions, and this is verifiable by anyone who's really looked at any kind of belief system, including the Celtic belief systems or beliefs in fairies or whatever other ghouls and goblins or the flying spaghetti monster, right? The point is that if you want to transmit an idea, so one of the best ways to do that is through abstract means, right? So these oral traditions, the rabbinical traditions, the Egyptian traditions, they've transmitted these ideas down through the centuries using these stories, which is basically what they are, to represent some very powerful ideas. And if you take those literally, Well, now you've got a problem because you've just created a dogmatic system, a dogmatic...
I mean, they could be parables. They could be just metaphors. You're 100% right. I would just add one thing to that. Obviously, we could continue talking for another hour quite easily. But what I would say is where I've come to now is that, I mean, Judaism is an ancient religion. I think from what I can see is the oldest established organized religion in history. But basically what happened was almost immediately when organized religions appear, what happens is you get another bunch of people come along and say, that's the exoteric. Now we're going to create the esoteric. So with Judaism, this is where Kabbalah, they didn't use the term Kabbalah straight away. That came later. But what happened was some Jews said that when Moses went up to the top of Mount Sinai, there were 70 elders at the bottom of the mountain that were received a verbal tradition. They received the words of God to teach them how to behave. That I believe that some even say that not even Moses was aware of this. So it's a secret world, secret knowledge that is only transferred to Jews once they hit a certain, well, that's tradition. I'm not sure how relevant it is today, but once they hit a certain age and they've learned a certain amount. So the Talmud being an oral tradition, this is why when you hear neo-Nazis talking about how terrible Jews are and how terrible the Talmud is, that's because within the Talmud, this oral tradition, which I would argue isn't really true Orthodox Judaism at all, there are all these dark occult themes, this dark Kabbalah themes within it that are quite frankly disgusting. And these are the things that the anti-Semites, the people that are against Jews, latch onto, suggesting that all Jews are like this. But of course, over time, Jewish tradition has become completely so intertwined with Kabbalah. It's difficult to separate one from the other. With like the Star of David, that's got nothing to do with Orthodox Judaism, and yet it's right there on the Israeli flag. But again, it's been a fascinating discussion, Michael, and I'd be very happy to have another discussion with you again in the future. Is there anything you'd like to add before we close, though? And please do tell people where they can find you online as well.
Well, you can find me on YouTube at Michael Black Speaks, youtube.com//Michael Black Speaks. You can also find me on Twitter. There's Twitter links on my YouTube page that will take you to my Twitter page and Facebook page as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's been great having you on the show, Michael. It's been very informative. All I'd like to say to people before we wrap it up here is, as usual, you can find older episodes of Philosochat on the playlist, which you can find on my channel page, the Philosochat playlist. And that's another Philosochat over. This is Philosochat over and out.